everybody, and welcome to me reading you, Alex Ryder, Book 4, Chapter 10, Pain Synthesis. Yasin told me all about you. Yasin told me all about you, Quay said. Apparently you worked for MI6. I have to say, that's a very novel idea. Are you still working for them now? Did they send you after me? I said nothing. If you don't answer my questions, I may have to stop thinking about doing nasty things to you. Or getting a sent to do them. That's what I pay for him for. Pins and needles, that's that sort of thing. MI6 don't know anything, Yasin said. He and Quay were alone in the room with Alex. The guard and the man called Henrik had gone. Alex was sitting on the sofa with a glass of chocolate milk that Quay had insisted on pouring for him. Quay was now perched on the piano stool. His legs were crossed and he seemed completely relaxed as he sipped another cocktail. There's no way the intelligence services could know anything about us, Yasin went on. And if they did, they wouldn't have sent Alex. Then why was he at the pleasure dome? Why is he here? Quay turned to Alex. I don't suppose you've come all this way to get my autograph? As a matter of fact, Alex, I'm rather pleased to see you. I was planning to come and find you one day. You completely spoiled the launch of my games player. Much too clever my half. I was very cross with you, and although I'm rather busy at the moment, I was going to arrange a little accident, like you did for that woman in Hyde Park. Alex asked. She was a nuisance. She asked impertinent questions. I hate journalists and I hate smart-ass kids too. As I say, I'm very glad you managed to find your way here. It makes life a lot easier. You can't do anything to me, Alex said. MI6 knows I'm here. They know all about Eagle Strike. You may have the codes, but you'll never be able to use them. And if I don't report in this evening, the whole place will be surrounded before tomorrow, and you'll be in jail. Quay glanced at Yasin. The Russian shook his head. He's lying. He must have heard us talking from the stairs. He knows nothing. Quay licked his lips. Alex realized that he was enjoying himself. He could see now just how crazy Quay was. The man didn't connect with the real world, and Alex knew that whatever he was planning, it was going to be on a big scale and very probably lethal. It doesn't make any difference, Quay said. Eagle Strike will have taken place in less than 48 hours from now. I will agree with you, Yasin. This boy knows nothing. He is irrelevant. I can kill him and it won't make any difference at all. You don't have to kill him, Yasin said. Alex was surprised. The Russian had killed Iron Rider. He was Alex's worst enemy, but this was the second time Yasin had tried to protect him. You could just lock him up until it's all over. You're right, Quay said. I don't have to kill him, but I want to. It's something I want to do very much. He pushed himself off the piano stool and came over to Alex. Do you remember what I told you about pain synthesis, he said? In London, demonstration pain synthesis allows game players to experience the hero's emotions, all his emotions, particularly those associated with pain and death. You may wonder how I programmed it into the software. The answer, my dear Alex, is by the use of volunteers such as yourself. I didn't volunteer, Alex muttered. Nor did the others, but they still helped me, just as you will help me. And your reward will be an end to the pain, the comfort and quiet of death. Quay looked away. You can take him, he said. The two guards had come into the room. Alex hadn't heard them approach, but now They stepped out of the shadows and grabbed hold of him. He tried to fight back, but they were too strong for him. They pulled him off the sofa and away, down one of the passages leading from the room. Alex managed to look back one last time. Quay had already forgotten him. He was holding the flash drive, admiring it. Yasin was watching him, and he looked worried. Then an automatic door shot down with a hiss of compressed air, and Alex was dragged away, his feet sliding out uselessly behind him, following the passageway to whatever it was that May and Quay had arranged. The cell was at the end of an underground corridor. The two guards searched Alex, emptying his pockets and taking away his mobile phone, and then threw him in. He twisted around to face them. One of the guards spoke. The door closes and it stays closed. You find the way out or you starve. That was it. The door slammed on Alex head, 2 bolts being drawn across. He heard the guard's footsteps fade into the distance. Suddenly everything was silent. He was on his own. He looked around. The cell was a bare metal box, about 5 meters long and 2 meters wide, with a single bunk, no water and no windows. The door had closed flush to the wall. There was no crack round the side, not so much as a keyhole. Alex knew he had never been in worse trouble. Quay hadn't believed his story. He had barely even considered it. Whether Alex was with MI6 or not seemed to make no difference to him. And the truth was that this time, Alex really got himself caught up in something without MI6 there to back him up. Once he had no gadgets to help him out break out of the cell, he had taken his mobile. He had brought the bicycle that Smithers had given him from London, Paris, and then to Amsterdam. But right now, it was parked outside the central station of the city, and would stay there until it was stolen or rusted away. Jack knew he had planned to break into the compound, but even if she did raise the alarm, how would anyone ever find him? Despair weighed down on him. He no longer had the strength to fight it. And still he knew almost nothing. Why had Quay invested so much time and money in the game system called the Games Player? Why did he need the flash drive? What was the plane doing in the middle of the compound? Above all, what was Quay planning? Eagle Strike would take place in 2 days. But where and what would it entail? Alex forced himself to take control. He'd been locked up before. The important thing was to fight back, not to admit defeat. Quay had already made mistakes, even speaking his own name on the phone when Alex judged him, called him from St. Pierre, had been an error of judgment. He might have power, fame, and enormous resources. He wasn't. He was certainly planning a huge operation, but he wasn't as clever as he thought. Alex could still beat him. But how to begin? Quay put him into this cell to experience what he called pain synthesis. Alex didn't like the sound of that, and what had the guard said? Find a way out or starve. But there was no way out. Alex ran his hands across the walls. They were solid steel. He went over and examined the door, and the second time, nothing. It was tightly sealed. He glanced at the ceiling, at the single bulb burning behind a thick pane of glass that only left the bunk. He found the trapdoor underneath built into the wall. It was like a cap flap, just big enough to take a human body. Gingerly wondering if it might be booby trapped, Alex reached out and pushed it. The metal flap swung inwards. There was some sort of tunnel on the other side, but he couldn't see anything. If he crawled into it, he would be entering a narrow space with no light at all, and he couldn't even be sure that the tunnel actually went anywhere. Did he have the courage to go in? There was no alternative. Alex examined the cell one last time, knelt down and pushed himself forward. The metal flap swung open in front of him, then travelled down his back as he crawled into the tunnel. He felt it hit the back of his heels, and there was a soft click. What was that? He couldn't see anything. He lifted a hand and waved it in front of his face. It was as if it wasn't there. He reached out in front of him and felt a solid wall. God, he had crawled rather, into a trap. This wasn't the way out after all. He pushed himself back the way he had come, and that was when he discovered the flap was now locked. He kicked out with his feet, but it wouldn't move. Panic, total and uncontrollable. impossible overwhelmed him. He was buried alive in total darkness with no air. This was what Gray had meant by pain synthesis, a death too hideous to imagine. Alex went mad, unable to control himself. He screamed out, his fist lashing against the wall of his metal coffin. He was suffocating. His flailing hand hit a section of the wall, and he felt it give way. There was a second flap. Gasping for air, he twisted around into the second tunnel, as black and as chilling as the first, but at least there was some faint figure of hope burning in his consciousness. There was a way through. If he could just keep a grip on himself, he might yet find his way back into the light. The second time was longer. Alex slithered forward, feeling the sheet metal underneath his hands. He forced himself to slow down. He was still completely blind. If there was a hole ahead of him, he would plunge into it before he knew what had happened. As he went, he tapped against the wall, searching for another passage. His head knocked into something and he swore. The bad language helped him. It was good to direct his hatred against Damien Gray, and hearing his own voice reminding him he was still alive. He had bumped into a ladder and took hold of it with both hands and felt for the opening that must be above his shoulders. He was lying flat on his stomach, but slowly he manipulated himself round and began to climb up, feeling his way in case there was a ceiling overhead. His hand came into contact with something and he pushed. To his huge relief, light flooded in. He had opened some sort of trapdoor with a large, brightly lit room on the other side. Gratefully, he climbed to the last rungs and passed through. The air was warm. Alex sucked it into his lungs, allowing his feelings of panic, claustrophobia, to fade away. Then he looked up. He was kneeling on a straw-covered floor in a room that was bathed in yellow light. 3 of the walls seemed to have been built with huge blocks of stone. Blazing torches slanted in towards him, fixed metal brackets. Gates at least 10 meters high stood in front of him. They were made out of wood, with iron fastenings and a huge face carved into the surface. Some sort of Mexican god with saucer eyes and solid, block-like teeth. I had seen this before, but it took him a few moments to work out where, and then he knew exactly what lay ahead of him. He knew how Gray programmed pain synthesis into his game. The gate had appeared at the start of Serpent, the game that Alex had played in the Pleasure Dome in Hyde Park. Then it had been a computerized image projected onto a screen, and Alex had been represented by an avatar, a 2-dimensional version of himself. But Gray had also built an actual physical version of the game. Alex reached out and touched one of the walls. Sure enough, they weren't really stone, but some sort of toughened plastic. The whole thing was like one of those walkthroughs at Disneyland, an ancient world reproduced with high-tech modern construction. There had been a time when Alex wouldn't have believed it was possible, but he knew with certainty that once the gates opened, he had found himself in a perfect reconstruction of the game. And that meant he would be facing the same challenges, only this time it would be for real flames, real acid, real space, and if he made a mistake, real death. Quay told him that he had used other volunteers. Presumably they had been filmed fighting their way through various challenges, and all the time, their emotions had been recorded and then somehow digitized, transferred, and programmed into the game's play system. It was sick. Alex realized that the darkness of the underground passage hadn't even been part of the real challenge that began now. He didn't move. He needed time to think, to remember as much as he could about the game he had played at the Pleasure Dome. There had been 5 zones. First, some sort of temple with a crossbow and a sword concealed in the walls. Would Gray provide him with weapons in this reconstruction? He would have to wait and see. What came after the temple? There had been a pit with a flying creature, half butterfly, half dragon. After that, Alex had run down a corridor, spears shooting out of the walls, and into a jungle, the home of the metallic snakes. Then there had been a mirror maze guarded by Aztec gods, and finally a pool of fire. His exit to the next level. a pool of fire. If that was reproduced here, it would kill him. Alex remembered what Cray had said. The comfort and the quiet of death. There was no way out for this madhouse. If he did manage to survive the fire zones, he would be allowed to finish it by throwing himself into the flames. Alex felt hatred well up inside him. He could actually taste it. Demay in Cray was beyond evil. What could he do? There would be no way back through the tunnels, and Alex wasn't sure he had the nerve to even try. He only had one choice, and that was to continue. He had almost beaten the game once. That at least gave him a little hope. On the other hand, there was a world of difference between manipulating a controller and actually attempting the action himself. He couldn't move or react with the speed of an electronic figure, nor would he be given extra lives. If he was killed once, he would stay dead. He stood up. At once the gate swung silently open, and there ahead of him was the temple that he had seen in the last game. He wondered if his progress was being monitored. Could he at least rely on an element of surprise? He walked through the gates. The temple was exactly how I remembered it from screen at the pleasure dome. A vast space with stone walls, carved in strange carvings and pillars, statues crouching at their base, stretching far above him. Even the stained glass windows had been reproduced with images of UFOs hovering over the fields of golden corn, and there too were the cameras swiveling to follow him and presumably to record whatever progress he made. Organ music, modern rather than religious, throbbed all around him. Alex shivered, barely able to accept that this was really happening. He walked further into the temple, every sense alert, ready for attack that he knew could come from any direction. He wished now that he had played feathered serpent more carefully. He had raced through the zones at such speed that he had probably missed half of the ambushes. His feet rang out on the silver floor ahead of him, rustling staircases that reminded him of a submarine or a submerged ship twisted upwards. He thought of trying one of them, but he hadn't gone that way when he was playing the game, and preferred not to now. It was better to stick with what he knew. That alcove that contained the crossbow was underneath a wooden plummet, carved in the shape of a dragon. It was almost completely covered by what looked like green ivy, but Alex knew that the twisted vines carried an electrical charge. He could see the weapon resting against the stonework, and there was just enough of a gap. Was it worth the risk? Alex tensed himself, preparing to reach it, then threw himself full length on the floor. Half a second later, it would have been fatal. He remembered the razor boomerang at the same instant that he had heard the whistling sound coming from nowhere. He had no time to prepare himself. He hit the ground so hard that the breath was driven out of him. There was a flash and a series of sparks. He felt a burning pain across his shoulders and knew that he hadn't been quite fast enough. The boomerang slashed open his t-shirt, also cutting his skin. It had been close to it had been a close thing. Any closer, and he wouldn't even have made it into the second zone. And suddenly the cameras watched everything was being recorded. One day it would have been fed into Cray's software, presumably Feathered Serpent too. I sat up and tried to pull his torn shirt together. At least the boomerang had helped in one way. It had hit the ivy, cutting it and short-circuiting the electric wires. I stretched an arm into the alcove and took out the crossbow. It was antique wooden iron, but it seemed to be working. Even so, Cray had cheated. There was an arrow in it, but it had no point. It was too blunt to damage anything. He decided to take both crossbow and the arrow with him anyway. He moved away from the alcove and over to the wall where he knew he would find the sword. It was about 20 meters above him, but there were loose stones and handholds indicating a way up. Alex was about to slap him, but then he had second thoughts. He had one close escape. The ward would almost certainly be booby-trapped. He would be halfway up and a stone would come loose. He would fall. He would break a leg. Quay would enjoy that, watching him lie helplessly on the silver floor until some other missile was fired into him to finish him off. And anyway, the sword would probably have no blade. But thinking about it, Alex suddenly realized that he had the answer. He knew how to beat the simulated world that Quay had built. Every computer game is a series of programmed events with nothing random, nothing left to chance. When Alex had played the game in Pleasure Dome, he had collected a crossbow and then used it to shoot the creature that had attacked him. In the same way, the locked doors would have keys, poisons would have had antidotes. No matter how much choice you might seem to have, you were always obeying a hidden set of rules. But Alex had not been programmed. He was a human being, and he could do whatever he wanted. It had cost him a torn shirt and a very narrow escape. But he had learned his lesson. If he hadn't tried to get a crossbow, he wouldn't have made himself a target for the boomerang. Climbing out the board to get the sword would put him in danger because he was doing exactly what he was expected. To get out of the world that Quay had built for him, he had to do everything that wasn't expected. In other words, he had to cheat. And he would start right now. He went over to one of the burning torches and tried to remove it from the wall. He wasn't surprised to find that the whole thing was bolted into place. Quay had thought of everything, but even if he controlled the holders, he couldn't control the flames themselves. Alex pulled off his shirt and wrapped it around the end of the wooden arrow, then he set it on fire. He smiled to himself. Now he had a weapon that hadn't been programmed. The exit door was at the far end of the temple. Alex was supposed to take a direct path to it. Instead, he went the long way round, staying close to the wall, avoiding any traps that might be lying in wait. Ahead of him, he could see the second chamber, the rain-drenched pit with its pillars rising from the depths, below and ending at floor level. He passed through the door and stopped on a narrow ledge. The top of the pillars, barely bigger than super plates, offered him a path of stepping stones across the void. Alex remembered the flying creature that attacked him. He looked up. Yes, there it was, almost lost in the gloom. A nylon wire running from the opposite side of the door above its head. He thrust upwards with burning arrow, holding the flame against the wire. It worked. The wire caught fire and then snapped. Quay had built a robotic version of the creature that had attacked him in the game. I knew that it would have swooped down when he was halfway across, rushing into him and knocking him off his perch, causing him to plunge into whatever lay below. Now he watched with quiet satisfaction as the creature tumbled down from the ceiling and dangled in front of him, a jumble of metal and feathers. That was more like a dead parrot than a mythical monster. And the way ahead was clear, but the rain was still falling, splashing down from some hidden sprinkler system. The stepping stones would be slippery. Alex knew that his avatar would have been unable to remove its shoes for better grip. He quickly slipped off his trainers, tied them together, and hung them round his neck. His socks went into his pocket. Then he jumped. The trick he knew was to do this quickly, not to stop, not to look down. He took a breath and started. The rain blinded him. The tops of the pillars were only just big enough to contain his bare feet. On the very last one, he lost his balance, but he didn't have to use his feet. He could move in the way that his avatar couldn't. He threw himself forward, stretching out his hands and allowing his own momentum to carry him towards safety. His chest hit the ground and he clung on, dragging his legs over the edge of the pit. He had made to the other side. A corridor ran off to the left, the walls close together and decorated with hideous Aztec faces. I remembered how his avatar had run through here, dodging between a hail of wooden spears. He glanced down and saw that there was what looked like smoke streaming on the floor. Acid. What now? He needed another weapon, and he had an idea. How to get one? He took out his socks, rolled them into a ball, and threw them down to the corridor. As he hoped, the move was enough to activate the sensor that controlled the hidden guns. Short wooden spears spat out of the lips of the Aztec gods at fantastic speed, striking the opposite wall. One of the spears broke in half. Alex picked it up and felt the needle sharp point. It was exactly what he wanted. He tucked it into the belt of his trousers. He still had the crossbow. Now he had a bolt that might fit it too. The computer game had been programmed so that there were only One way forward, Alex had been able to dodge both the spears and the acid river easily enough when he was playing feathers urban, but he knew he would be unable to do the same in this Gross-Tech 3-dimensional version. He'd only have to take one false step and he would be finished. He could imagine splashing into the acid and then panicking. He would be driven straight into the path of the spears as he tried to reach the next zone. No, there had to be another way. Alex forced himself to concentrate. Ignore the rules. He turned the three words over and over to his mind. Moving along the corridor wasn't an option. How about up? He put on his shoes, then took a tentative step. The spears nearest the entrance had been fired. He was safe, so long as he didn't move too far down the corridor. He grabbed a hold of the wall and balancing the crossbow over his shoulder, began to climb. The Aztec heads made perfect footholds, and only when he was at the very top he began to make his way along, high above the floor and away from danger. One step at a time, one step at a time. He edged forward. He came to a camera mounted in the ceiling and, with a smile, wrenched out the wire. There was a lot of it, and he decided to keep that too. He reached the end of the corridor and climbed down into the fourth zone. The jungle. He was surprised to discover that the vegetation pressing in on him from all sides was real. He had expected plastic and paper. He could feel the heat in the air, and the ground underfoot was soft and wet. What traps were waiting for him here? He remembered the robotic snakes that had barely managed to get close when he played the game. He searched ready for the tracks that would propel something similar his way. There were no traps. Alex took another step forward and stopped, paralyzed by the horror of what he saw. There was a snake, and like the leaves and the creepers, it was real. It was as thick as a man's waist, at least 5 meters long, lying motionless in a patch of long grass. Its eyes were 2 black diamonds. For a brief second, Alex hoped it might be dead, but then its tongue flickered out, and the whole body heaved, and he knew what he was facing. He was facing a living thing, one that was beyond nightmares. The snake had been encased in a fantastic bodysuit. Alex had no idea how long it could have survived wrapped up like this. As terrifying as the creature was, he still felt a spark of pity for it. Seeing what had been done, the suit was made out of wire that had been twisted round and round the full length of the animal, with vicious spikes and razor welded out from the neck all the way to the tail. Looking past the tail, Alex could see a dazzle of line cut into the soft ground. Whatever the snake touched, it sliced. It couldn't help itself, and it was slithering towards him. He couldn't have moved if he had wanted to, but something told him that keeping still was the only chance he had. The snake had to be some sort of boa constrictor, part of the Bode family. A useless piece of information he had picked up in biology class suddenly came back to him. Snake ate mainly birds and monkeys, finding its victims by smell, then coiling around and suffocating them. But Alex knew that if the snake attached him, this wouldn't be how he would die. The razor and spikes would cut him to pieces, and it was getting closer. Wave and wave of glinting silver rippled behind it as it dragged the razors along. Now they were just a meter away. Moving very slowly, Alex lowered the crossbow from his shoulder. He pulled the wire back to load it, then reached into the waistband of his trousers. The broken spear was still there. Trying not to give the snake any reason to attack him, Alex fixed the length of wood into the stock. He was lucky. The spear was exactly the right length. He wasn't meant to have a weapon in this zone, but that hadn't been part of the program. But despite everything Cray had thrown at him, he still had the crossbow, and now it was loaded. Alex cried out. He couldn't help himself. The snake had suddenly jerked forward, dragging itself over his trainer. The razor cut into the soft material only millimeters away from his foot. He instantly kicked out. At once, the snake reared back. I saw black flames ignite in its eyes. Its tongue flickered. It was about to launch itself at him. He brought the crossbow round and fired. There was nothing else he could do. The bolt had entered the snake's mouth. And continued out the back of his head, and slipped back, avoiding the deadly conversion of the creature's body. The snake thrashed and twisted, cutting the grass and the nearby bushes to shreds. Then it lay still. And he knew that he had killed it, and he wasn't sorry for what he had done to the snake. What he had done to the snake was revolting. He was glad he had put it out of its misery. There was one more zone left, the mirror maze. I knew that there would be Aztec gods waiting for him, probably guards in fancy dresses. Even if he got past them, he would only find himself facing the pool of fire. But he hadn't had enough. To hell with the remaining crate. He looked up. He had disabled one of the security cameras, and there weren't any others in view. He had found a blind spot in this inside playground that suited him perfectly. It was time to find his own way out. Chapter 11. The Truth About Alex Rider. There are no gods crueler and more ferocious than those of those Aztecs. That was the reason why the mayor and Cray had chosen them to inhabit his computer game. He had summoned 3 of them to patrol the mirror maze. For the 5th and the last zone in the huge area he had built beneath the compound Tlaloc. The god of rain was half human, half alligator with jagged teeth, claw-like hands, and a thick, scaly tail that dragged behind him. Skype Totec, the Lord of Spring, had torn out his own eyes. They were still dangling in front of his gruesome, pain-distorted face, and Solotl, bringer of fire, walked on feet that had been smashed and wrenched round back to back, face backwards. The flames leapt out of his hands, reflected 100 times in the mirrors, and adding to the twisting clouds of smoke. Of course, there was nothing supernatural about the 3 creatures waiting for Alex to appear. Beneath the grotesque masks and plastic skin and makeup, there were nothing more than criminals recently released from Bijlmer, the largest prison in the Netherlands. They now worked as guards for Cray Software Technology, but they had special duties too. This was one of them. The 3 men were armed with curved swords, javelins, steel claws, and flamethrowers. They were looking forward to using them. It was the one dressed as Oxolotl who saw Alex first. The camera in Zone 3 had gone down, so there'd been no way of knowing if Alex was on his way or if the snake had finished him, but suddenly there was movement. The guard saw a figure lurch round a corner, naked to the waist. The boy was making no attempt to hide, and the guard saw why. Alex Rider was soaked in blood. His entire chest was bright red. His mouth was open and closing, but no sound came out. Then the guard saw the wooden spear sticking out of his chest. The boy had obviously tried to run down the corridor, but he hadn't quite made it. One of the spears had found its target. Alex saw the guard and stopped. He dropped to his knees. One had pointed limply at the spear. Then he fell. He looked upwards and tried to speak. More blood trickled out of his mouth. His eyes closed and he pitched to one side. He didn't move again. The guard relaxed. The boy's death must mean nothing to him. He reached into the pocket of the chainmail shirt and took out a radio transmitter. "It's over," he said, speaking in Dutch. The boy had been killed by a spear. Neon strips flickered on throughout the game zone in the harsh white light. The different zones seemed cruder, more like fairground attractions. The guards, too, looked ridiculous in their fancy dress. The dangling eyes were painted ping-pong balls. The alligator body was nothing more than a rubber suit. The backward-facing feet could have come out of a joke shop. The 3 of them formed a circle around Alex. "He's still breathing," one of them said. "Not for much longer." The second guard glanced at the point of the spear covered in rapidly congealing blood. What shall we do with him? Leave him here. It's our job. Disposal can pick him up later. They walked away. One of them stopped to a side. A wall painted to look like crumbling stone and pulled open a concealed panel to reveal a button. He pressed down, the wall slid open. There was a brightly lit corridor on the other side. 3 men went off to change. Alex opened his eyes. The trick he had played was so old that he was almost ashamed. If it had been done on the stage, it would have fooled a 6-year-old. But he supposed that circumstances were a little different here. Left on his own in the miniature jungle, he had reclaimed the broken spear that he used to kill the snake. He had tied it to his chest using the wire he had torn out of the security camera. Then he had covered himself with blood taken from the dead snake. That had been the worst part. But he'd had to make sure that the illusion would work. Steeling himself, he had scooped up some more of the blood and put it into his mouth. He could still taste it now, and he was having to force himself not to swallow. But it had fooled the men completely. None of them had looked closely. They had seen what they wanted to see. What they wanted to see. Ike waited until he was certain he was alone, then sat up and untied the spear. He would just have to hope that the cameras had all been turned off when the game ended. The exit was still open, and Ike stole through, leaving the make-believe world behind him. He found himself in an ordinary corridor stretching into the distance with tiled walls and plain wooden doors on either side. He knew that although the immediate danger was behind him, he could hardly afford to relax yet. He was half naked and covered in blood. He was still trapped in the heart of the compound, and it could only be a matter of time before somebody discovered that the body had disappeared and realized that the trick had been played. That had been played. He opened the first of the doors. It led into a storage cupboard. The second and third were locked, but halfway down the corridor he found a changing room with showers, lockers and laundry baskets. Alex knew that it would cost him precious minutes, but he had to get clean. He stripped and showered, then dried himself and got dressed again. Before he left the room, he searched through the laundry basket and found a shirt to replace the one he had burnt. The shirt was dirty and 2 sizes too big, but he pulled it on gratefully. Carefully, he opened the door and quickly closed it again as the two men walked past, talking in Dutch. They seemed to be heading for the mirror maze, and Alex hoped they weren't part of the disposal team. If so, the alarm would be raised at any moment. He counted seconds until they had gone, then crept out and hurried the other way. He came to a staircase. He had no idea where he went, but he was certain he had to go up. The staircase led to a circular area with several corridors leading off it. There were no windows. The only illumination came from industrial lights set at intervals in the ceiling. He looked at his watch. It was 11:15. 2.25 hours had passed since he had first broken into the compound. It felt much longer. He thought about Jack waiting for him in the hotel in Amsterdam. She would be out of her mind with worry. Everything was silent. I guessed that most of Quay's people would be asleep. He chose a corridor and followed it to another staircase. Again, he went half and found himself in a room that evening. Quay studied the room where he had seen the men called Charlie and Obadiah. Alex was almost afraid to go in, but the room was deserted, and peering through the opening, he could see the bottle-shaped chamber had been cleared. The money and the body had taken away. It seemed strange to him that there should be no guard assigned to this room. At the very heart of Quay's network. But then again, why should there be? All the security was centered on the main gate. Ike was supposed to be dead. Quay had nothing to fear. Ahead of him was the staircase that he knew would lead up to the glass cube and out onto the square. But as he was raced over it, Alex realized he would never have another opportunity like this. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew that if he made it to MI6, he should have no proof that Quay wasn't just the pop celebrity and businessman that everyone thought. Alan and Miss Jones hadn't believed him the last time he'd seen them. They might not believe him again. Ignoring his first instincts, Alex went over to the desk. There were about a dozen framed photographs on the surface, and everyone showing a picture of May and Quay. Ignoring them, Alex turned his attention to the drawers. They were unlocked. The lower drawers contained dozens of different documents, but most of them were nothing more than lists of figures and harder looked promising. Then he came to the last drawer and let out a gasp of relief. The metallic capsule that Quay had been holding when he had talked to the American was simply sitting there. Alex picked it up and weighed it in his hand, in the palm of his hand. The flash drive, it contained a computer codes. Its job was to break through some sort of security system. It had come with a price tag and $2.5 million it had cost Robert's life. And Alex had it. He wanted to examine it, but he could do that later. He slipped it into his trouser pocket and hurried over to the stairs. 10 minutes later, the alarm sounded throughout the compound. The two men that Alex had seen had indeed gone into the mill maze to pick up the body and discovered that it wasn't there. They should have raised the alarm at once, but there had been a delay. The men had assumed that one of the other teams must have collected it and had gone to find them. It was only when they discovered the dead snake and the spill with a coil of wire that they put together what had taken place. While this was happening, a van was driving out of the compound. Neither the tired guards or not at the gate nor the driver had noticed the figure lying flat, spread-eagled on the roof, but why should they? The van was leaving, not arriving. It didn't even stop in the front of the security camera. The guard merely checked the driver's ID and opened the gate. The alarm ran seconds after the van had passed through. There was a system in place that created software technology. Nobody was allowed to enter or leave during a security alert. Every van was equipped with a two-way radio, and the guard at the gate immediately signaled to the driver and told him to return. The driver stopped before he had even reached the traffic light and warily obeyed, but it was already too late. He slipped off the roof and dropped to the ground. Then he ran off into the night. Wow. Domain Quay was back in his office, sitting on the sofa holding a glass of milk. He had been in bed when the alarm went off, and now he was wearing a silver dressing gown, dark blue pajamas, and soft cotton slippers. Something bad had happened to his face. The life had drained out of it, leaving behind a cold, empty mass that could have been cut out of his glass. A single vein throbbed above one of his glazed eyes. Quay had discovered that the flash drive had been taken from his desk. He had searched all the drawers, ripping them out, upturning them and scattering their contents across the floor. Then, with an inarticulate howl of rage, he had thrown himself onto the desktop, flailing about with his arms and sending telephones, files and photographs, frames flying. He had smashed the paperweight into his compound screen, shattering the glass, and then he had sat down on the sofa and called for a glass of milk. Yasin Grigorovich had watched all of this without speaking. He too had been called out of his room by the alarm bells, but unlike Quay, he hadn't been asleep. Yasin never slept for more than 4 hours. The night was too valuable. He might go for a run or walk out in the gym. He might listen to some classical music. On this night, he had been working on a MacBook with a pile of CDs. He was teaching himself Japanese, one of the 9 languages he had made it his business to learn. Yasin had heard the alarms and known instinctively that Alex Ryder had escaped. He had turned off the tape recorder and he had to smile. Now he waited for Quay to break the silence. It had been Yasin who suggested quietly that Quay should look for the flash drive. He wondered if he should get the blame for the theft. He was meant to be dead, Crane moaned. They told me he was dead. He glanced at Yasin, suddenly angry. You knew he'd been in here? I suspected, Yasin said. Why? Yasin considered. Because he's Alex, he said simply. Then tell me. There's only so much that I can tell you, Yasin said into the distance. His face gave nothing away. The truth about Alex is that there is not a boy in the world like him. He began speaking slowly and softly. Consider for a moment tonight. You tried to kill him, and not just simply with a bullet or a knife. but in a way that should have terrified him. He escaped and he found his way here. He must have seen the stairs and any other boy and any man even want to climb them instantly. His only desire would have been to get out of here, but not Alex. He stopped. He searched. This is what makes me unique, and that is why he's so valuable to MI6. How does he find his way in here? I don't know. If you'd allowed me to question him before you sent him into the game wheels, I might have not been able to find out. This is not my fault, Mr. Gregorowitz. You should have killed him in the south of France when you had the chance. Quay drank the milk and set the glass down. He had a white moustache on his upper lip. Why didn't you? He demanded. I died. That nonsense bullring was stupid. I think you knew he'd escape. I hoped he might. Yasin agreed. He was beginning to get bored with Clay. He didn't like being asked to explain himself, and when he spoke, again, it was almost as much for his own benefit as Clay's. I knew him, he said. You mean before St. Pierre? I met him once, but even then, I knew him already. The moment I saw him, I knew who he was and what he was. The image of his father. He had then stopped himself. He already said more than he had meant to. He knows not the oldies, he muttered. No one has ever told him the truth. But Cray was no longer interested. I can't do anything without the flash drive, he moaned, and suddenly there was tears brimming in his eyes. It's all over. Eagle Strike, all the planning, years of it, millions of pounds, and it's all your fault. So there was the finger of blame. For a few seconds, Yasin Gregorowitz was seriously tempted to kill Demey and Cray. It would be very quick. 3 fingers strike into the pale, flabby throat. Yasin had worked for many evil people. Not that he had ever thought of them in terms of good and evil. All that mattered to him was how much they were prepared to pay. Some of them, Horowitz, for example, had planned to kill millions of people. The numbers were irrelevant to Yasin. People die all the time. He knew that every time he drew a breath. At that exact moment, somewhere in the world, 100 or 1,000 people would be taking their last. Death was everywhere. It could not be measured. But recently something inside him had changed. Perhaps it was meeting Alex that had done it. Perhaps it was his age. Although Yasin looked as if he was in his late 20s. He was in fact 35. He was getting old. Too old anyway for his line of work. He was beginning to think it might be time to stop. And that was why he decided not to murder Demey and Cray. Eagle Strike was only 2 days away. It would make him richer than he could have dreamt, and it would allow him to return at last to his homeland, Russia. He would buy a house in St. Petersburg and live comfortably, perhaps doing occasional business with the Russian mafia. The city was teeming with criminal activity, and for a man with his wealth and experience, anything would be possible. Yasin stretched out a hand. The same hand he would have used to strike his employer down. You worry too much, he said. For we know Alex may still be on the compound, and even if he has made it to the gate, he can't have gone far. He has to get out to Sloterdijk and back to Amsterdam. I've already instructed every man we have to get out of there and find him. If he tries to get into the city, he'll be intercepted. How did you know he would be going into the city? Cray demanded. It's the middle of the night. Where else could he go? Yasin stood up and yawned. Alex will be back here before sunrise, and you'll have your flash drive. Good. Cray looked at the wreckage scattered across the floor. And next time I'll get my hands on him, I'll make sure he doesn't walk away. Next time I'll deal with him myself. Yasin said nothing, turning his back on Demey and Cray. He walked slowly out of the room. Chapter 12. Pedal Power. The local train pulled into Amsterdam Central Station and began to slow down. Alex was sitting on his own, his face resting against the window, barely conscious of the long, empty platforms of the great canopy stretching over his head. It was about round midnight, and he was exhausted. He knew Jack would be frantic, waiting for him at the hotel. He was eager to see her. He suddenly felt a need to be looked after. He just wanted a hot bath, a hot chocolate and bed. The first time he had got out of Sloterdijk, He had cycled both ways, but the second time he had saved his energy and left the bike at the station. The journey back was short, but he was enjoying it, knowing that every second put Craig and his compounder just a few more meters behind him. He also needed time to think about what he had just been through, try to understand what it all meant. The plane that burst into flames, a VIP lounge, something called Millstar, the man with the pockmarked face, and he still had no answer to the biggest questions of all. Why was Craig doing all this? He was massively rich. He had fans all over the world. Only a few days ago, he had been shaking hands with the President of the United States. His music was still played on the radio, and his appearance drew massive crowds. The games player system would make him another fortune. If ever there was man who he had needed to come silent and kill, it was him. Eagle strike. What did the two words mean? The train came to a halt. The doors hissed open. Alex tested the flash drive within his pocket and got out. There was barely anyone around the platform, but the main ticket hall was more crowded. Students and other younger travellers were arriving on the international lines. Some of them were slumped on the floor, leaning against oversized rucksacks. They all looked spaced out in the heart of artificial night light. Alex guessed it would take him about 10 minutes to cycle down to the hotel on the Herrengatch. If he was awake enough to remember where it was, he passed through the heavy glass doors and found his bike where he had left it. Changed to some railings. He had just unlocked it when he stopped sensing danger before he even saw it. This was something he'd never learnt. Even his uncle had spent 20 years training to be a spy. When unable to explain it, the instinct told him that now he had to move in fast. He looked around. There was a wild cobble already, area leading down to an expanse of water, with the city below. A kiosk selling hot dogs was still open. Sausages were turning over a burner, but there was still no sign of vendor. A few couples were strolling along the ridges over the canals, enjoying a night that had become so warm and dry. The sky wasn't black so much as a deep midnight blue. Somewhere a clock struck the hour, the chimes echoing across the city. Alex noticed the car, perhaps so that it faced the station. Its headlamps blinked on, throwing a beam of light across the square towards him. A moment later, a second car did the same. Then a third. All three cars were the same. Two-seater smart cars. More lights came on. There were 6 vehicles parked in a semicircle around him, covering every angle of the station square. They were all black with their short bodies and slightly bulbous dark driving compartment. They looked almost like toys, but Alex knew the feeling of cold certainty that they weren't here for fun. Doors swung open, men slipped out, turned into black silhouettes by their own headlamps. For a split second, nobody moved. They had him. There was nowhere for him to go. Alex stretched out his left thumb, moving it towards the bell that still looked ridiculous, attached to the handlebar. There was a small silver lever sticking out. Pushing it would ring the bell. Alex pulled. The top of the bell sprang open with a real fire button inside, each one a different colour. Smithers had described them in the manual. They were colour-coded for ease of use. Now it was time to find out what they worked. As if sensing that something was about to happen, black shadows had begun to move across the square. Alex pressed the orange button and felt the shadow beneath his hands as 2 tiny heat-sinking missiles exploded on one of the end of the handlebars, trailing orange flames. They shot across the square. Alex got the men to stop, uncertain. The missiles soared into the air. They curved, their movement perfectly synchronized, and as Alex had suspected, the hottest thing in the square was the grill in the hot dog kiosk. Missiles fell on it, both striking at the exactly same time. There was a huge explosion, a fireball of flame that spread across the cobbles and was reflected into the water of the canal. Burning fragments of wood and pieces of sausage rained down. The blast hadn't been strong enough to kill anyone, but it had created a perfect diversion. Alex grabbed the bike and dragged it back to the station. The square was blocked. This was the only way. But even as he re-entered the ticket hall, he saw the other men roaring across the concourses towards him. At the time of the night, the crowd was moving slowly. Anyone running had to have a special reason. Alex knew for certain that the reason was him. crazed men must have been in radio contact with each other now. Now that one group had spotted him, they would all know where he was. He jumped on the bike and pedaled along the flat stone floor as fast as he could, past the ticket booths, the newspapers, kiosks, the information boards, and the ramp leading up to the platforms, trying to put in much space as he could between himself and the pursuers. A woman pushing a motor-sized cleaning machine stepped in front of him, and he had to swerve, almost knocking out a bearded man with a vast rucksack. The man swore at him in German. Alex raced on. There was a door at the very end of the main hall, but before he could reach it, it burst open, and more men came running in, blocking his way, pedaling furiously. Alex spun the right round and headed for the one way out of this nightmare, an empty escalator going down. Before he even knew what he was doing, he launched himself into the metal treads, and it was bounced and shattered headfirst into the ground. He was thrown from side to side, his body slamming against the steel panels. He wondered if the front wheel would crumple with the strain, or if the tires would puncture against the sharp edges. But then he reached the bottom, and he was riding bizarrely through a subway station with ticket windows on one side and automatic gates on the other. He was glad it was so late. The station was almost empty, but still a few had turned in astonishment as he entered a long passageway and disappeared from sight. It was definitely the wrong time for this, but even so, Alex found himself admiring the bad boy's handling ability. The illuminating frame was light and manageable, but a solid sound tube kept the bike stable. He came to a corner and automatically went into attack position. He pressed down on the outside pedal and put his weight on it, at the same time keeping his body low. The entire centre of gravity was focused on the point where the tyres came into contact with the ground, and the bike took the corner with total control. This was something Alex had learned years ago. Mountain bikes in the Pennines. He had never expected to use the same technique in a subway station and on the Amsterdam. A second escalator brought him back up to street level, and Alex found himself on the other side of the square, away from the station. The remains of the hot dog kiosks were still burning. A police car had arrived, and you could see the hysterical hot dog salesman trying to explain what had happened to an officer. For a moment he hoped he would be able to slip away unnoticed, but then he heard the screech of tires as one of the smart cars skidded backwards and knocked and then shot forward in his direction. They had seen him, and they were after him again. He had pedalled down the Damroek and one of the main streets in Amsterdam, quickly picking up speed. He glanced back. A second smart car had joined the first. And with sickened heart, he knew that his legs would be no match for their engines. He had perhaps 20 seconds before they caught up with him. Then a bell clanged, and there was a loud metallic clattering. A tram was coming towards him, thundering along the tracks on its way to the station. Alex knew what he had to do. He could hear the smart cars coming up behind him. The tram was a great metal box, filling his vision ahead. At the very last moment, he twisted the handlebars, throwing himself directly in front of the tram. He saw the driver's horrified face, felt the bicycle wheels shudder as they crossed the tracks, but then he was on the other side, and the tram became a wall that would at least for a few seconds separate him from the smart cars. Even so, one of them tried to follow. It was a terrible mistake. The car was halfway across the tracks when the train hit it. There was a huge crash, and the car spun away into the night. It was followed by terrible grinding and the metal lick and metallic screaming as the tram derailed. The tram's second carriage whipped round and hit the other smart car, batting it away like a fly. As Alex pedalled away from the Damroek across a pretty white painted bridge, he left behind him a scene of total devastation. The first police siren cutting through the air. He found himself cycling through a series of narrow streets that were more crowded with people drifting in and out of pornographic cinemas and striptease clubs. He had accidentally drifted into the famous red light district of Amsterdam. He wondered what Jack would make of that. A woman standing in a doorway winked at him. Alex ignored her and rode on. There were 3 black motorbikes at the end of the street. Alex groaned. They were 400cc Suzuki Bandits, and there could be only one reason why they were there, silent and unmoving. They were waiting for him. The moment their riders saw him, they started their engines. Alex knew he had to get away and fast. He looked around. On one side of him, dozens of people were streaming in and out of the parade of neon-lit shops. On the other, a narrow canal stretched into the distance, with darkness and possible safety. On the other side, but how was he going to get across? There wasn't a bridge in sight, but perhaps there was a way. The boat was turning. It was one of the famous glass-topped cruisers, sitting low in the water and carrying tourists on a late-night dinner cruise. It had swung diagonally across the water so that it was almost touching both banks. The captain had misjudged the angle and the boat seemed to be jammed. Alex propelled himself forward simulationally. He pressed the green button under the bicycle bell. There was a water bottle suspended upside down under his saddle, and out of the corner of his eye he saw silver-grey liquid squirt out onto the road. He was hurtling towards the canal, leaving a snake-like trail behind him. He heard the roar of the Suzuki motorbikes and knew that they had caught up with him. Then everything happened at once. Alex left the road, crossed the pavement, and forced the bike up into the air. The first of the motorbikes reached the section of the road that was covered with the ooze. And once the driver lost control, skidding so violently that he seemed to be throwing himself off on purpose. His bike smashed into a second bike, bringing that one down too. At the same time, Alex came hurtling down onto the reinforced glass roof of the tourist boat and began to pedal its full length. He could see Diane was gazing up at him in astonishment. A waiter with a tray of glasses spun around and dropping everything. There was a flash of the camera, then he reached the other side, carried by his own momentum. He soared off the roof, over a line of bollards, and came to a skidding halt on the opposite bank of the canal. He looked back just in time to see that the third bandit had managed to follow him. It was already in the air as the divers from the boat were gazing up in alarm as they descended towards them. They were right to be scared. The motorbike was too heavy. It crashed on the glass roof, which shattered beneath it. Bike and rider dissipated in the cabin as the tourists, screaming, threw themselves out of the way. Plates and tables exploded. The lights in the cabin fused and went out. Alex didn't have time to see more. He wasn't going to be able to hide in the darkness at all. After all, another pair of bandits had found him, roaring up the side of the canal towards him, pedalling frantically. He tried to get out of sight, turning into one road, cutting down another, and round the corner, across the square. His legs and thighs were on fire. He knew he couldn't go on much further. And then he made his mistake. It was a dark alleyway, dark and inviting. It would lead him somewhere he wouldn't be found. That was what he thought. But it was only halfway down when a man suddenly stepped out in front of him holding a machine gun. Behind him, the two bandits edged closer, cutting off the way back. The man with the machine gun took aim. Alex's fingers tapped down, this time finding the yellow button. And once there was an explosion of brilliant white light as the magnetism flare concealed inside the digital evolution headlight ignited. Alex couldn't believe how much light was pouring out of the bike. The whole area was illuminated. The man with the machine gun was completely blinded. Alex hit the blue button. There was a loud hiss somewhere on his legs. A cloud of blue smoke poured out of the air pump connected to the bicycle. The two bandits had been chased up behind him, and now they plunged into the smoke and disappeared. Everything was chaotic. Brilliant light and thick smoke. The man with the machine gun opened fire, sensing that Alex must be somewhere near. But Alex was already passing him, and the bullet went wide, slicing into the first bandit and killing the driver instantly. Somehow, the second bandit managed to get through, but then there was a startling scream and the sound of metal smashing into brick. The gradual bullet stopped, and Alex smiled grimly to himself, realizing that what had happened. The man with the machine gun had just been run over by his friend on the bike. His smile faded as yet another smart car appeared from nowhere, still some distance away, but already getting closer. How many of them were there? Surely crazed people would decide they'd had enough and give it a rest. But then Alex remembered the flash drive in his pocket and knew that Cray would rip all out Amsterdam apart to get it back. There was a bridge ahead of him, an old-fashioned construction of wood and metal with thick cables and counterweights. It crossed a much wider canal, and there was a single barge approaching it. Alex was puzzled. The bridge was far too low to allow the barge to pass. Then a red traffic light blinked on. The bridge began to lift. Alex glanced back. The smart car was about 50 metres behind him, and this time there was nowhere to hide, nowhere else to go. And he looked ahead of him. If he could just get to the other side of the canal, he would really be able to disappear, but nobody would be able to follow. At least not until the bridge had come down again. But it looked as if he was already too late. The bridge had split in half, both sections rising at the same speed. The gap over the water widening with every second. The smart car was accelerating. Alex had no choice. Feeling the pain and knowing that he had reached the last reserves of his strength, Alex pushed down, and the bike would get picked up speed. The car's engines were louder now, howling in his ears, but he didn't dare look back again. All his energy was focused on the rapidly rising bridge. He hit the wooden surface when it was at 45 degrees slant. Insanely, he found himself thinking of some long-forgotten math lesson at school. A right-angled triangle. He could see it clearly on the board, and he was cycling up inside. He wasn't going to make it. Every time he pushed down on the pedals, it was a little harder, and he was barely halfway up the slope. He could see the gap huge down in the dark, cold water below. The car was right behind him. It was so close he could hear nothing apart from its engine, and the smell of petrol filled his nose. He pulled it one last time, and at the same moment, he pressed the red button in the bell, the ejector seat. There was a soft explosion right below him. The saddle had rocketed off the bike, propelled by compressed air or some sort of ingenious hydraulic system. Alex shot into the air over his side of the bridge, over the gap, and then down on the other side, rolling over and over as he tumbled all the way down. As he spun round, he saw the smart car incredibly. It had tried to follow him. It was suspended in mid-air between the two halves of the bridge. He could see the driver's face, the open eyes, the gritted teeth. The car plunged down. There was a great splash, and it sank at once beneath the black surface of the canal. And he got painfully to his feet. The saddle was lying next to him, and he picked it up. There was a message underneath. He wouldn't have been able to read it while the saddle was attached to the frame. If you can read this, you owe me a new bike. Smith had a warped sense of humour. Carrying the saddle, Ice began to limp back to the hotel. He was too tired to smile. Well, that'll be the end of this long video. So, bye-bye everyone, and thank you for listening to this book.